Our wonderful executive producer, Mr. Dave Tabb, is in the house today. God bless him. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you, Dave.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, pal.
It's good to be here.
Hey, everyone. Connor here. We just want to take a moment to thank you so very much for tuning in and being a part of the Decon Chamber family. Your support keeps us going, and we couldn't do this without you.
And if you love what we do and want to help us even more, please consider joining us on Patreon. You'll get exclusive perks, behind-the-scenes content, and even opportunities to chat with us directly.
And don't forget to check out our awesome merch, because who doesn't want to rep their favorite podcast in style, baby?
Every little bit helps, I promise you. And we're really very, very grateful for all of you who make this show possible. So thanks for being there. And please enjoy this episode of the Decon Chamber.
The show has begun with Connor and Dom. It's the Decon Chamber.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, Trekkies and Trekkers, welcome back to another watch party episode of the Decon Chamber. I'm your co-host, Dominic Keating, joined as always by my bestie, my fellow co-host, my old castmate, Mr. Connor Trinneer's in the house.
Heyo.
And we have a special surprise, which is just lovely. I don't think we've all seen each other in over 20 years. One of the co-writers of this episode, Serialization, that we shall peruse today, Mr. Mike Sussman is here. Thank you, Mike.
My
for coming
pleasure.
On board.
Good to be with you guys.
To see you. Yeah. You're looking well. I mean, literally, that's an uncluttered life right there.
It's a special filter.
It is it? I've got to get one.
It's an app. It's an app.
I'm loving the two posters behind you. We were just talking before we came on air. That's the poster that UPN assuaged me with my lividness when I was left off the poster with the EV suits here in town, driving along Sunset in my town. And
You may have to explain to your audience what UPN is.
yeah, really, what is UPN? The United Paramount Network, for those that are too young to have remembered its short-lived memory of being a network.
Yes.
It didn't get something like, I don't know. I'm trying to think what was what made Fox?
Married with Children.
No, the cartoon.
The Simpsons.
The Simpsons. Yeah, they needed a Simpsons, and they didn't have one.
Or a Family Guy. Yeah, that would have been
Little Family Guy,
Yes.
and yeah.
Maybe if our show had been animated,
Yeah, no kidding.
the laugh
Right.
track, I would have watched that.
Lord knows, I did my best with the acting, but it wasn't enough.
Or was the writing, apparently.
Before we get started to the episode, I would like, if you wouldn't mind, sort of walking us and the audience through, like, how does an episode get written from the seed to production? How does it? What's the navigation of that? Especially as were you on staff? You were a staff writer, right?
Yeah, I was on staff on Enterprise, and in fact, my writing partner at the time, Phyllis, and I were on staff on Voyager on its final season 7, and we were carried over to Enterprise, and so we went from being like the least experienced Voyager writers to being, outside of the showrunners, the most experienced writers on Enterprise. So it was, that first season, there were a lot of, there was kind of a revolving door in terms of the writers and the writing staff. There
Wasn't there? Yeah.
The show was really trying to figure out what it was. And I think in some ways, this episode, I have a lot of affection for it, for the cast, the guest cast. I think the production design is really pretty good. Mike Vehar, I believe, who directed this, he's directed like 6 or 7 episodes that
Yeah, it was Vehar.
Yeah.
Over Voyager and Enterprise. He's terrific. But, as we'll get into, there were some real world things going on that affected, I feel, the episode. Plus, the episode itself was really, to me, kind of emblematic of what issues the show and the writers were struggling with in that first season. Like, what was this show going to be? How was it different from the other series? What kind of stories were we going to tell? And I think what we set out to do with this episode was not perhaps entirely successful. for reasons we can chat about. That said, I have so much affection for this episode. I think there's a lot of sweet little moments in it.
Mm.
It kind of wears its heart on its sleeve. It doesn't really work on a deeper level in any way, like a thematic or a character level. It's very light, and that's okay. But I still have a lot of affection for
In
it.
many ways, I felt like it's a real throwback to classic Trek. The captain gets his kiss, and
Sure.
it's a real going to a planet, sorting some stuff out, some nefarious stuff, and moving on with as little footprint as possible. And that's to me is classic.
Yeah, no,
Um,
absolutely. I think that, well, that's, what we were going for. Whether we actually accomplished it or achieved it, I guess is debatable. But, I think we had our heart in the right place. But again, there was some stuff going on in the world that was really, that made the filming of this episode really unusual and difficult. And that, also affected the direction of the show ultimately, months and years down the line. So it's for me, in some ways, this episode, not only the conception of it, but the outside events that affected the production. It's kind of a demarcation line for me. Like the show wasn't quite the same after this. What was the show
No, it
going to
would,
be?
yeah.
I mean,
you're
we're dancing
referring, of
around what
course,
it was. I mean, 9/11
uh,
happened during the production.
you're referring, of course, to it was the week of 9/11, wasn't it? We
September 11th, 2001. That's
Yeah,
right.
it was a
Yeah.
tough
And
week.
I've said over and over again that, you have to remember that our show was different after 9/11, and there was no going back. There was,
Yeah.
yes, I sort of gave us our theme.
It did ultimately in the third season, but I
Yeah.
think, and a lot of television shows really struggled with this, comedy shows in particular,
Mm.
which we were not, at least not intentionally. But what was the were we going to reflect what was going on in the world? And I think at first it seemed, well, how could we? Enough time had not gone by, and we need to do our thing and kind of hold our heads up high. But I think ultimately it became something we couldn't avoid, that we had to explore those themes because that's what was going on in the world.
Yeah.
But I mean, had 9/11 not happened, I think this episode still showed that we were, really kind of, struggling isn't the right word, but like trying, what was Enterprise trying to be? All of the Star Trek series, even the modern ones, it seems, the first 2 years, sometimes longer, they don't quite know what they are, and they're trying to find their footing. And
Right.
it's true for Next Gen. It was I think true for Voyager, and it was true for us. You think it would get easier the more shows there have been, but in some ways, it's I think it's kind of harder for each series to find like what makes it unique, and
Because
what it wants to be.
you're threading the needle with a variation of a theme, and how do you thematically change that to bring originality to a new show is
Yeah.
when you're caught in the slipstream of the theme of the show, and that's tricky.
Sure.
I
Well,
mean,
to go back to what Connor asked, I mean, one of the first questions that you generally get asked about an episode is, why is this an episode of Enterprise and not Deep Space Nine or Next Gen? Why would they have done this episode exactly the same way? And if they would have, then there's something wrong with the premise. We need to find what makes it unique to our series. One of there's a writer, I'm sure, whose name has been brought up to you before, Michael Piller, who's the showrunner on Next Gen and Voyager, and co-creator of Voyager and Deep Space Nine. And I didn't really know Michael very well. He was running Voyager when I was an intern there in the 90s.
Right.
But he had this. His dictum was basically, each episode had to be about a particular member of our crew. This is a Geordi episode this week. This is a B'Elanna Torres episode the following week. And so how do the plots affect our character? And I think one of the lessons that we didn't follow with this particular episode, Civilization, was that there was some nice stuff for everybody, but it wasn't really, an Archer episode. It wasn't a Reed episode. It wasn't a Trip episode. Again, everybody got some nice things to do, I think, but it didn't really work on that deeper character level that we aspire to. And I think, we always aim for that. We don't always achieve it, but we aim for it.
And when you're handed, what are you handed? Are you handed an outline of the story? Then you go with at the time Phyllis and go and write it together. How does it evolve from idea to getting us
The first draft, or
saying the
Yeah,
words?
well, I'm trying to remember. This may have been our first written by credit for Enterprise. I'm
did you
not.
pitch this to Brannon and Rick, as it were? This was your.
Yeah, this was our idea because I remember we did an episode called Strange New World,
Yeah.
singular,
Yeah.
which was a fun show as well. But that was a story I think Rick and Brandon had given us, and so we
Yeah, I
were,
think.
as Connor, as you suggested, handed an outline. Here's like a 6, 7, 8 page outline with each scene with the main beats. That particular episode, Strange New World, evolved quite a bit. This one, again, it's funny because our first, we were really going back to basics with the show, or trying to. I mean, we're literally taking apart the opening titles of the original series, Space, the Final Frontier, these are the voyages of the Enterprise. We explore strange new worlds. That was one episode. Seek out new civilizations. That was this episode.
Yeah.
And so I think it was, I can't remember the exact genesis of it, but I know at one point our title for this was Aliens, which would not have probably gone over very well. Um, and probably would have seemed too threatening, but we were really just trying to, deconstruct, the what Star Trek is, what the missions are, and part of the problem maybe you simply don't want to look too closely, when you're dressing up in native garb and meeting the locals, and we have little funny things on our forehead. It's all very cute and charming. It reminds me of something I think Brent Spiner said once. Star Trek is like half Shakespeare, half running around with a Superman cape around your neck.
Yeah.
And if you get too deep into the reality of it, it can fall apart.
It does look like they're all going off, and again in the shuttle pod, they're all going off to summer stock.
Yeah, it really does. It really
Yeah.
does. But again, that's the charm of it. I wish this episode had had a little more fun with that, a little more self-awareness. That's something I think some of the newer shows do very nicely. And I think in the writers' room we were taking ourselves a little too seriously. And I think you guys on the set would have, totally played with that lighter attitude had it been there in the script. But again,
Yeah, well, I mean, that has changed a lot, hasn't it? That dynamic in the shows. And now we have Strange New Worlds, which really does have a tongue firmly in its cheek the whole time. And that was not present during our years. It, as you say, the show did take itself quite seriously, right down to the dead letter perfect rendition of everything you wrote. And there was never any leeway for improv or yeah, that is
yeah.
a distinct difference. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much improv they get to do on the show these days, but
They get some.
They
yeah,
do. Yeah. Yeah. They always get a take where they've got it in the can, and now it's like do whatever you want. And
right, right.
sometimes it works, and often as not it won't. But they do.
I
Did
was
you
I was
find?
I was going to say too. I think I always find it kind of amusing that whenever talking about a pre-industrial civilization, it's always Shakespeare time.
Yeah. What they've got in the costume deck?
That's right. That's right.
Out in the valley, there's a lot of. I thought that. I mean, I think it's a very cute episode, and I think some of it. I mean, when his translator goes off, and he uses the ruse to kiss her not once
Yeah.
but 3 times to cover that up is
That was
absolutely
yeah.
charming. I giggled furiously.
That
Yeah.
was lovely. And it even ended up becoming like the tag of the episode. I want to give credit. I think where credit is due. I think that was a contribution that my writing partner, Phyllis, had contributed. But I mean, for me, that was like the best moment in the script. Um, but the show could have used a little more of that. We were definitely looking to infuse it. That was something that came up very late, I think, in the writing. Um, but yeah, it was a lovely little moment.
I've noticed in watching this first season, and this changes, but initially, anytime anybody but the captain is at the helm, it's kind of like, ooh, Oh, what's this like?
Oh yeah, yeah.
And
Paul takes
yeah,
command once or twice, and I think Trip is ready to throw a mutiny. If
exactly.
Mm.
Well, don't sit in that chair.
You've got another really good trip line in there. What is it again? Hee-haw line. Do you remember what it was?
I
I mean,
don't.
it is so hee-haw. I can't think what it was now.
Well, speaking of lines, I think you could make a Star Trek drinking game out of this one episode and probably be hammered by the end of it.
Mm.
Every time somebody says some kind of, I mean, I caught it
Uh,
at least 4 or 5 times, and maybe more.
yeah.
Some kind of
Uh-huh.
force field, some kind of dampening field, some kind of energy weapon. It was just like, oh my God. Did
Some
anyone
kind of
prove this script?
apothecary.
Yeah,
And
some kind of apothecary.
from pen to screen, what's your take on how it turned out?
Well,
Of,
again,
everything in at what you can control, as it were.
yeah, I mean, clearly we could not control what was going on in the world. And I think that kind of cast a pall over the whole episode. It's hard for me to separate my memory and my experience of making the episode and what was going on in the world. And if you recall, we shut down production that day,
Yeah.
which is, I don't know that we ever did previously or again on our show. Um, it was really hard to look at that show, even now watching it, knowing what was going on in the world and how dark things were, to kind of sit back and enjoy this little lighthearted romp that was a throwback to the original series. It just feels like it just feels wrong. It feels wrong. And, we couldn't know what was going on when we were writing it or what was going to be happening in the world. But again, it really, this, what was going on outside the walls of the studio really did affect where the show wanted to go, where it needed to go. And ultimately, there was a course correction and probably, the end of season three, the recognition that we needed to address that. And we did. And we did plenty of terrific episodes, I think, in the first 2 seasons. But the world was changing, television was changing,
Mm.
serialized television was starting to become a thing. I think the one show that didn't struggle with 9/11 was 24, which had just
Yeah.
and was heavily serialized. And some of our writers, Brannon, obviously, and Manny Cotto, who would come on in season three, went on to write for 24.
Mm.
Um, and they were able, without talking specifically about the events of 9/11, were able to do stories that reflected on those themes. Ultimately, we did that as well on our show. But it was a struggle. It was a struggle knowing, when was it going to be appropriate to do that and do it in a Star Trek kind of way.
How
Do you
much of
think
a leap
there was
was
any
it
kind
to
of a
do?
disconnect between our audience and what was going on and what we were doing at the time?
Well,
In
I
season
think
one in particular.
Um, I don't know. I think again, I think even the audience was reeling about what was going on in the world, and I think look, we're entering some very interesting days in the world right now, and I think people need an escape. I think they want to watch their shows, their dramas, and that can take them away from painful events that are happening in the world, and I think we did provide that. Um, but Star Trek has always been a show that addressed what was going on in the world, through
Mm.
allegory, metaphor, whatever. And even though we did try and keep those events at bay, ultimately it became something we had to embrace, or at least the feeling was we had to embrace it and embrace it in a big way,
Yeah.
which we did. But yeah, I think the audience was struggling along with us, quite frankly.
Was it a big leap in the writers' room with Brannon and Rick to serialize season three like 24? That was quite a break for Star Trek that these weren't standalone, particularly episodes. And
Sure. I mean, we're all very, as writers, we were all very excited by it, certainly. But we had never really done anything that heavily serialized. I mean, Deep Space Nine had done a Dominion War and a Klingon War arc that lasted several seasons. And but I think I would dare say our third season was more heavily serialized, and had, a direct threat to the planet Earth that our characters had to deal with, and put our characters in morally questionable situations, which again was sort of the point of doing that. Um, but yeah, we had only like the vaguest idea of where we were going in season three. Um, uh, I'm trying to remember, did we do 24 or 26 episodes in season three? I think
Season three, we did 26, 26, 25, 24, didn't we?
sounds about right. Well, I think we did 22, the
It
final.
might have been 22
That's what-
somewhere in there. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think
We wound
three
up
might have
with,
been
well,
22.
yeah, we wound up with 99 and 100 if you count the pilot being 2 episodes.
Right, 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 right.
I think it's 98 actually.
Again, the business of television was changing. If you remember, UPN was burning off sometimes 2 episodes a night of our show. And, there was sort of a feeling, because I know I've chatted with Scott about this, and I think there was definitely a feeling in the writer's room that, we weren't getting necessarily the promotion, the show wasn't feeling that special if you're just sort of dumping 2 episodes every Wednesday night.
Yeah.
And they weren't, it wasn't an event. It wasn't a special two-parter, as Voyagers occasionally did. They did some really excellent two-parters. So what was the question again?
Well, yeah, I mean, just how difficult it was to serialize that season three.
Oh yeah, the serialization. Yes. No, it was
Keep that
it
sort
was
of
a
ball in the
real
air.
challenge. It was a real challenge. And it's amazing because I've heard on some of, on 24, they would frequently have to throw out scripts and then go back and shut down production. We didn't have to do that on our show, on season three, but it was a challenge mapping it all out. And I wouldn't want to necessarily do it again, do a 24 episode heavily serialized arc. It was nice to do once. Today it would be 8 or 10 episodes, which is much more doable.
Right.
I mean, I just finished watching Adolescence, which is 4
Yeah.
Yeah.
episodes.
There you go.
And it works. It does come down to, I guess you have, you can rate your episodes throughout a season. And as you were talking about, it may not have felt like, your best one. But, we've got to fill the gaps with, especially at the time in
Yeah.
episodic television. Man, what a grind to do 26, 24, 22, regardless. What a grind to have to accomplish that in, what do we have, the 9.5 months to do that.
Sure. Yeah. Again,
Unprecedented what they did in the Cooper building. It really is over those years. And the legacy, series of Trek. It really is. It's
fun though. I mean, it was a lot of fun, and because there was such a heavy demand for stories, you could, as a mid-level writer, which is really what I was, a writer producer at the time, you could get your pet ideas on the show because they just simply needed so many stories. Season one here, we were doing 26, and if something sounded like a half decent original idea, it would get developed. It wouldn't always get.
Yeah. I got turned down 3 times and they were half decent ideas, I'll tell you. Brannon. Control freak.
Yeah, you don't quite know. And look, I have folders on my computer of ideas that.
Oh, you do?
make
Do
the
you
cut,
still
so.
got yeah, right. It was Michael Piller was the one that really gave you your first. You wrote the last episode for Voyager, wasn't it? Was it Meld? Is that right?
Oh, that was the first episode I wrote.
That was the first episode you wrote.
Yeah.
And then I'm trying to think. You wrote 30 episodes, pretty much for. Was it just for Voyager or Voyager and Enterprise included?
I think between, because you end up doing a lot of writing and rewriting on things that other writers are credited on, which is part of the job. I think I'm credited on like 35 something episodes between Voyager and Enterprise. But a lot of those, probably even most of those, were, with other writers. It really is a team sport.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, we should talk a bit more sort of in detail about the episode. that first teaser gag when we teased the captain about, we found three rocks and I mean, how does that inception start? It was a nice, roll of the dice to come into the episode.
Yeah, it was,
That
again, I think conceptually it's not my favorite way into one of our episodes. I don't know if it was, particularly successful, but we were trying to make, again, the show was trying to be sort of a lighter throwback.
Right.
I was looking though, I found some of the other ideas that we had for starting the show because we pitched a bunch, I think, to Brandon, and I could be mistaken, but I think what's in there now was his pitch back to us. But like one idea was that Archer was in the mess hall by one of those big windows, and he was like on a table sunning himself from the light of this star that they were approaching.
All right.
And so Paul comes in and points out how he can't really get a tan through the window, and he just wanted to feel the warmth of the sun on his body, which is which that was kind of goofy. I'm glad we didn't do that, but we were looking for a very unfamiliar enterprise. You never would have seen Picard sunning himself through a window on Next Gen.
He'd get his head burned.
He'd get his head burned. So, but yeah, that's the kind of stuff that
He's a sir, you can't just make jokes about that.
So we were trying to find, how do we make this episode, this show uniquely Enterprise, and what did that mean to be uniquely Enterprise? I still ask myself that question 20, 25 years later.
It's an interesting, delicate balance. It's you're riding a blade when you're talking about going to meet a, pre-industrialized group of people and having, what influence could you have had if somebody found you out? And it felt like a little bit bull in a china shop, if you know what I mean, in terms of going down. There was a little bit of thinking about whether or not, giving that woman who was wonderful. What was
she was on Diane DeLasquio. She was lovely, wasn't she?
And at the end of the episode, he's like, kind of like, don't tell anyone
right.
that we were here.
Yeah, I like this. So it was laid out that she was clearly ahead of her time in her time.
Sure.
An apothecary.
And in any other world with any technical advantage, she would have been a brilliant scientist. I also love that scene where she's tootling around her apothecary desk, and Archer says something. Well, what are you making? And she goes, tea.
Yeah,
I thought that was absolutely charming. Would you like some? Very good gag.
Yeah, and I have little charming moments like that, I think.
Yeah, and I think that also Wade Williams, is that his name?
Yes, Wade Andrew Williams, to be fully correct.
Fantastic.
He was lovely, wasn't he?
I closed my eyes and I swear to God, I felt like I was listening to Orson Welles. He had his voice that was, you could tell he was definitely theater trained and a theater actor.
Yeah, and he didn't gild the lily too much at all. There was no sort of Dr. Evil about him. And I like the fact that to him it was like, what's a few what were they called, the alkali?
Right.
What's a few alkali for the betterment of getting viridium for our people, and a few casualties along the way, such is the way of things. Toughen up, mate. I rather like that, and plus ça change, as they say. Yeah.
Was the writing still being finished when 9/11 did happen? Because that would echo like a 9/11 kind of reaction from what he says and what you're just mentioning, Dominic. Were you mid-writing or were we in production by the time? Because I know we were in production. I remember not going to work that.
Oh yeah, no, we were. Yeah, you must have been. I can't. Were we starting that episode the day it went off, or had we shot a day?
I feel like you may have shot.
I think we may have shot a day because yeah.
And
then Mary Howard rang us all and said, we're taking the day, and but we were back the next day. I was only a green card holder in those days, but I never felt more American in my life going to work.
Yeah, I don't know if you recall. I mean, at the time, you could pre 9/11, you could just drive onto the Paramount lot and wave to the guards.
Yeah,
and that changed obviously very quickly right after. And I noticed also the score of this episode. I'm trying to remember. I think it was a Jay Chataway who scored it. One of my favorite Trek composers, but I don't know. It kind of has like a dour theme to it, which again, maybe it fits the visuals, maybe it fits
Mm,
what we wrote and what the cast performed, but
yeah.
it doesn't quite have the. And again, had he done something a lot more upbeat, might have like totally not worked.
A
But
lot of the scenes are shot at night, as it were, in the twilight, in
yeah,
undercover and spying on, and that's probably what he was going for,
yeah, there
rather.
was a lot of like there was kind of an X-Files mystery going on with
Yeah.
productions and things like that, which was cool and relatively suspenseful. But again, this particular episode didn't quite know, I think, what it wanted to be, and I had we drilled down a little more, I think, on character and made it a more personal story for one of you gentlemen or for Scott's character or Hoshi or whoever it is, it might have had a little more of an emotional core to it.
We'd done a lot of those episodes prior to this. We were sort of introducing and establishing who these characters were, and you're right. This is one of the first ones where we sort of all have a little shot in the episode.
Which I think you can get away with if you have like a Star Trek also does really wonderful heavy plot laden shows that don't necessarily have a strong character element. Uh,
Right.
but it has to be, I think, a kind of a fun, original, high concept story for that to work. Like in season two, Phyllis and I did an episode with the Borg, Regeneration.
Mm.
And I think ultimately it was kind of a successful episode. Didn't really have it had a little bit of a dilemma, I think, for Archer, but it was just kind of a really fun romp with like hints of time travel and connection to the larger franchise and a great a lot of action set pieces that I think David Livingston directed. Um, and it just totally worked. This episode didn't really have that plot you hadn't seen before. We've seen this plot on Star Trek before,
Yeah.
done better, quite frankly. And in our efforts to sort of like deconstruct it, we could have dug a little deeper again, into character, into story, and figured out what made this a unique story to tell on our series. And I just I throw that back at us, the writers. We just didn't dig deep enough.
If
As
you were
writers,
going to make,
as writers, do you have a post-mortem in the room after an episode airs, or do you ever do anything like that?
God, it's a great idea. I mean, yes and no. I mean, you might get a pat on the back, from your boss. Hey, that was, saw the episode last night. It was really good. But again, as you guys probably know, I don't know if you had time to always watch the show when you were working on it. I'm sure at the end of the long day, that might be the last thing you'd want to do. There are certainly episodes that I don't know that I've ever even seen in their entirety, having watched like all the dailies and participated in the rewrites and all the different versions of the script. By the time the actual episode airs,
Mm.
if it wasn't mine, if it wasn't one that I was shepherding and producing, I'd probably had like sort of like let it go because we were on a train here. We had 26 episodes to figure out. So we would come in and we'd have meetings. We'd talk about where the show was going, how the series was working, what direction we wanted to go, what characters we hadn't serviced in a while, and what stories we'd have for those people. But that's actually a really good idea, Connor. The idea of a sort of like
It is hard
ER
to believe
style post-mortem.
that it wasn't sort of required watching, that you actually watched the shows. Yeah, but yeah, I mean, I
I'm
have to
sure it
say
would have
I
been very
still think the
painful to
same.
sit there the next day after the episode aired and have all your writer colleagues pick apart all the things you did wrong.
Yeah, right, right.
Well, let me ask you, if you were, let's say we were going to make Archer the sort of, the real central figure of this episode, what can you think of ways that you would have dug a little deeper into his relationship with Rianne, or his handling of this, Menchara class, but somewhat ancient Civilization.
Yeah, that's a great question. I wish I said I did. I wish I had in the 20 plus years figured out how to make this a better episode, but I haven't really. I mean, I what I can do is compare it to the other shows that have done
Mm.
episodes, undercover episodes like this. Um, Next Gen did a really wonderful episode called Who Watches the Watchers. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that one, where they find sort of a proto-Vulcan type society and they live in a desert. And anyway, Picard has to come clean with them and basically break the Prime Directive and tell them they begin to think Picard is a god. And he needs to, and they start to worship him. So
Is that when it happened?
and it went to Patrick Stewart's head.
Like the man who would be king kind of thing.
All right.
Man Who Would Be King was an episode of Voyager, quite frankly.
It was, yeah.
They did a really terrific episode that was very much inspired by that, which was the sequel to a Next Gen episode. So again, I think had we glommed onto not necessarily a movie that had already been done, but a kind of a higher concept story, you could have done our version of this episode. And right now it is it's a very straight ahead story. There's some bad guys on a planet mucking around with the locals, and we're gonna put a stop to it.
Mm.
There was a very convenient action, by using the teleporter to get that nuclear warp coil
The
out.
reactor. Yeah.
The reactor.
Yeah, it was a very Star Trek sort of gag where we beam up their own weapon and use it against them. It worked.
Had we used it before?
I think that may have been the first time. I mean, I have to
might have
confess,
been the first time.
I think it was a kind of an old chestnut of mine because I've done that on other episodes of our show where we beam off a component from the adversary and then use it against them. But it's a fun idea. You just can't keep doing it over and over again.
Right.
As I did.
What's your favorite episode that you wrote for our show?
There's a couple. In season 4, the last episodes I wrote for Star Trek for our show were the Mirror Universe episodes. Those were a lot of fun.
You did, yeah. Yes, that was you, wasn't it? Yeah.
But I did season
highly
3.
rated in the telling of our show. I know they're very popular.
Yeah, it was just a lot of fun to throw you guys a curveball and give you something different to play. Put you in the makeup chair for longer than you probably wanted, I would guess.
Yeah, no offense to you guys, but I hated them.
He hates them. Well, he got scuppered into playing a pirate by Conway.
Yeah.
And
Jim Conway banked a scene that I was like, I was kidding. But I had to do that for the next 3 weeks, and of course,
he really was pieces of eight.
Midway through. What's that?
You really were pieces of eight. Pieces of eight.
Char.
You have to look at those episodes, though. It's it's an upside down Star Trek universe. I mean, who prevails in the end? But Hoshi and Travis,
All right,
the characters who more often than not got the least to do on our show, and they're the ones standing tall at the end, and everyone else is dead.
Right.
And that, of course, has a very odd place in the the annals of our history because it was in between those two that we got cancelled.
That's right.
We remember that. And whoever was going to direct the second one, I don't know whether it was because we were cancelled. Suddenly, they didn't show up to direct, and Marvin Rush ended up stepping up. And it was, in many ways, I've said many times, it was very fitting that it was so in-house and it was a family affair. That second episode of the.
Those were a lot of fun, but I mean, to answer your question, what was probably my favorite episode was a season 3 episode I wrote called Twilight.
Yes, good episode, mate. Yeah,
where I think both of you gentlemen, because it had this alternate future. Well, Connor, you got to be the captain of the Enterprise. And Dominic, you got your own ship too, if I remember.
Yeah, that's right.
So you're welcome.
It didn't stick, but thank you.
No, I know.
You got a bump in pay that week, right? I mean, at least.
You think Lower Decks would come to us at least, but no, Jolene.
What in terms of writing for character, like you just mentioned, Hoshi and Travis, and are you is it predetermined who's going to be the focus of an episode if there is one?
Well, sure. I mean, again, that's the lesson that I think, Brandon was our showrunner, and Brandon learned at the knee of, Michael Pillar.
Right.
Michael, who came in season 3 of Next Gen, that the show was kind of foundering at the time in terms of the scripts, and they were doing a lot of very techy and plot heavy shows, and he decided to just kind of do a 180 and decided that every episode of Next Gen was going to have a focus on one of the standing characters. So you can do a super sci-fi, high-tech mystery story or action story, but how does it affect, how does it affect Geordi? How does it affect Beverly? How is this a Picard story? And that gave those episodes an emotional depth that the show had really been missing. And so, yeah, I think, and there have been episodes, like there was a Voyager episode I worked on. I was a freelancer, and I was brought in to write the script for an episode, but it was like episode 25 of season 6. So they gave me this sort of like half thought out idea of like this ghost story on Voyager. And it wasn't about anybody. It wasn't about any of the particular characters. So I was like grasping. I was like grasping at straws. How do I make this? How do I make the audience care? Whose story is this? And I settled on Neelix, who is a wonderful little, wonderful character. And he just seemed to be, he just kind of fit this sort of haunted house thing we were trying to do. But I didn't really have like permission from anybody to make it a Neelix story. And when I turned in the draft, it was actually not well received because I had sort of like split the difference. I tried to make it a Neelix story, but like didn't go all the way. And because they had to shoot the damn thing, the writers and producers took it, rewrote it, made it like 100% a Neelix story, which I take a little, give myself a little bit of credit for, even though there's very little of what I did. And there's some of it, like maybe 20% of the episode is me. But yeah, if you're given an outline or you have a story that doesn't have a character focus, boy, you're going to find that out really quickly when you go to teleplay.
Right.
Scenes are just going to lie there. They're just going to be flat.
Yeah, it scares the Jesus out of me sitting down to sit in front of a blank screen and going, well, who says what first and where are they saying it? I mean,
Right.
do you just dive in and get that first draft done and then use that as a framework to then, better it, as it were?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what you're supposed to do. I've never been I'm jealous of writers. I work with writers who could just what they call it, the vomit draft,
Right.
where you just kind of, the first thing that comes to mind, just put it on the page and then you come back and rewrite it.
All right.
Again, the really great thing about working on Star Trek is because you get to write so much. You really do. I mean, back in the day, during the Rick Berman era, there were so many stories, you didn't have the luxury of sitting in your office and just staring out the window and throwing, a baseball at the ceiling over and over. You had to figure things out quickly, and you had deadlines. I spent nights in that office, many late
Did
nights,
you?
even a New Year's Eve once. Believe
No
me.
kidding.
Wow.
Did you have a cot?
Did not have a cot. I had
Mm.
an
Sofa.
uncomfortable couch that was actually a couch that I had hauled across the country, believe it or not. And
I love those stories about, actors and, people who creatives who are like, yeah, no, that futon, that futon's.
and I left it behind too. I like to think that that couch is somewhere floating around the Paramount lot being used by somebody for afternoon quick naps or something.
Nothing else is getting made there at the moment, I don't think.
Yeah. How did you find yourself in Star Trek?
Well, I pursued it. I pursued it like a maniac.
Yeah, you're a bit of you're a
Right.
fan, aren't you? You're a Trek head.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, it was certainly the only show I was aware of that would even look at scripts or story ideas from outside writers.
Hmm.
And so I was living on the East Coast, and at the time, Michael Pillar, realizing what a bind he was in, finding writers, and more importantly, like finding ideas to give to the writers who had already used up the ones that they'd come in the door with. he instituted an open door submission policy where if you
Right.
wrote a script and signed a release form, they would have a professional reader summarize it and look at it. And so I wrote a bunch of scripts and from the East Coast and mailed them in. And I remember one time it took like a whole year before I even got a printed rejection form. Um, but later, after I moved out here, one of those same scripts got me into the internship program at Voyager. And then
Hmm.
on the last day of that internship, one of my jobs as the intern was to read the unsolicited scripts that had been submitted to the show and sit down with Michael Pillar and tell him if there were any of them that had an idea that we could borrow and turn into an episode. And none of them really worked for him. And he said, I remember he said to me literally, like, is that all you got? And I said, well, I have an idea. I was very prepared and pitched him a story. And that became
You
that.
gave him the worst ones first, did you?
Yeah, exactly. This is gonna seem better than these ideas.
Yeah.
And that became the episode Mel that I wrote the story for, and
Right.
wrote the teleplay for I guess season 2 of Voyager. So, but yeah, no, I had my eye set on Star Trek. That was kind of all I wanted to do at the time.
Hmm.
That was my and fortunately, between Deep Space Nine and Voyager, they were making 52 episodes a year.
Right.
Yeah.
What was
So
Michael
there
Pillar's background before coming to Trek? Had he done science fiction stuff before? I'm not really
I'm not
aware.
sure he had done sci-fi. I think he'd done Simon and Simon and some more like network procedural type of things. I remember because we sort of bonded. I really only knew him for those 6 weeks that I was there because when I came back on the Voyager, he had become a consultant and moved on to other shows. But we also both had a background in television news, and
That's right,
so we
you
kind
did,
of
didn't you?
bonded over that.
Right.
Um, and it's some of the earliest Star Trek stories that I sold actually came out of my work as a news writer. Right? You had to read all these different real world stories that some you'd write about, some you wouldn't for the newscast, and a lot of them were like almost like quasi sci-fi or a story that you could turn into a sci-fi parable. And some of the, again, the very first stories I did a 2-part episode of Voyager as a freelancer called Unimatrix Zero. It was about the Borg. It was the first Borg story I sold. But that came from an article about the anniversary of the internet at the time. It was like 1999 or 2000 or something. And I just found a way to fuse the idea of the Matrix and the internet with the Borg and put a fresh spin on the Borg, who by that point had been kind of done to death almost really on Voyager and give it a new spin. But we really drove it into the ground with that episode. So. But yeah, that was always my objective. That was really the only thing I knew how to do or wanted to do, which was to write for Star Trek. So it was a great thrill to not only write for Voyager, but to come aboard this show at the very inception, be there from the beginning. I remember looking outside my office window. I think it was the day that we got confirmation that Scott was going to be Archer.
Right.
And I know they'd been pursuing him and they hadn't been pursuing any other actor for that role. And we just learned that he had been signed. And where the Cooper building was, or not the Hart building rather, we looked down on the commissary and the restaurant, the Paramount restaurant. And we saw all of you guys, the cast, like sort of like mingling outside. I don't know, it was like before lunch or after lunch. And we saw Scott. We were like, oh my God, is that Scott Bakula? We hadn't met him yet. And he was shaking hands with everybody. And we're like, did we just watch like this crew meet for the first time? It was like
Yeah, probably.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, that must have been after our read through.
Read through the table
Yeah.
read. Yeah, indeed. And
those were some amazing days. They really
they
were.
really were. They were halcyon days. I mean, Connor and I never stop, sensing that now, all these years later, just how fortunate we were to be on that franchise show at that studio at that time.
Sure.
It really, we were pigs in clover. We really
Yeah,
were.
it was some of the last times I think that, it really felt like a proper studio. At least it did
Yeah.
for us. And now it just seems to be sort of a patchwork quilt of different things either going on or not going on, on
Yeah.
the
I
Um,
don't know what's going to become of it now. It's going to get split up, isn't it? I mean,
they sold it, right?
it is, yeah. It's the deal's been done,
Hmm.
and
Are you talking about the Skydance acquisition?
yeah.
I don't know. I mean, from what I hear, it hasn't been completed yet,
Well,
but
yeah, no, it hasn't. I mean, it's
it might be a renaissance for that lot. I mean, it's a really beautiful lot. It's kind of sad though, as you know, going visiting, you know, Fox or some of these other lots in recent years. There's just not a lot going on like there used to be. And
Yeah.
hopefully, we'll find a way, whether it's through new tax breaks or
tax breaks. I
new
mean,
production, to bring these shows and movies back to LA because
yeah, no kidding. I mean, when you the fact that it's cheaper to go to South Africa and take an entire cast than shoot in town is just nuts. It
yeah.
is, yeah.
Do
And
you
look,
travel a lot now in work? And not shooting in LA or working in LA. I'm sure you can stay wherever you are as a writer, but do you travel to production out of LA?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly have. I've done a you know a fair amount of stuff in Canada. You know, I've been lucky in that many of the projects I've worked on have shot here, but that is such a rarity these days.
Yeah.
And it's hard because it introduces a separation between the writers and the cast and crew.
because you're not actually there, as it were, right?
Yeah. Now, what's kind of interesting and you know about our show. uh, you know, because we had to do so many episodes, the prevailing attitude in the Heart Building was that if you're on the set hanging out with the director and the cast, then you probably don't have enough work to do. Like we've got stories to break back here in the Heart, but what are you doing hanging out on the set?
Right.
That philosophy has like done a complete 180 these days, where writers are on the set working with the director, you know, scene by scene, explaining the tone, maybe making some dialogue adjustments. I think that was one of the reasons, perhaps the reason why, you know, the cast was asked to stay, you know, letter perfect, was that there was simply no time to have anybody down there to
Right.
approve a change. And if we could afford to have, afford in terms of the time, afford to have a writer on the set who could say, you know, Connor or Dom just had this really terrific idea. Why don't we try this? But we just couldn't do that. You know, we'd had, I think it was 6, 7, 10 writers. I don't know how many we had on season one. There were a lot, and they were all needed all the time on rewrites in the writer's room, breaking stories, coming up with you know, coming up with an episode that's already been shot in the can that Livingston directed, and it's like 10 minutes short, and now you need to write brand new scenes for a finished episode,
Right.
fit in it perfectly, but the guest cast is on and the sets are struck. There was so much to do. It just felt like a luxury to be down there.
Yeah, we never saw you guys. I mean, really, from the once the pilot was done, uh, it was it was a rare
Well,
thing to see.
Phyllis of any of the writers spent more time on set than I think anybody I can remember.
Oh, yes, she did.
And didn't make it past season one. I
No,
might be
because
lying there.
it's a lot of fun to be on the set. It really is, or it can be, and it can also be very boring for a writer because there's not a whole lot to do. But I think also because we had you know, you guys got to be in so many episodes, you know, 26 a year. The directors were veterans by and large. You often didn't need our help, quite frankly.
Hmm.
And I think that was the prevailing attitude at the time. Um, but again, the business is very different now, and I'm glad it is. It's much more of a, you know, each episode is now more of a bespoke little jewel rather than what's the term they use? You know, a filler episode.
Well, right.
You know, an episode to just get us to the next mythological arc that we might be exploring. Um, but it was a very different time. It was a very different time in TV, and it was changing. The world of TV was
It
changing. I
really
think
was.
we as a show were caught up in that. We really were.
Did you know it? Did you feel it at the time in the writers' room that the sands were shifting? I don't know that we felt it, you know, actually in production. But did you kind of see the writing on the wall that this network thing was, you know, going to change dramatically in the next, you know, few years?
No, I wish I could say that we did. Again, this particular episode, which I guess we're still ostensibly talking about, Civilization, really was that was that line in the sand, was that moment where if we weren't sure that the world was changing and that television had to adapt with it, that week we shot this episode, it again took a little while, took weeks and months and maybe even years to sink in, but it shows that we had to change um, and address what was going on in the world. Otherwise, the show, I think, in season two, and season two has some of my favorite episodes of the whole series, quite frankly, but it started to feel a little bit adrift. Like, what were we doing? What was the point of what we were doing? And a lot of that was brought on by the big things that were going on in the real world at the time that we were not addressing. We were choosing not to address,
Right.
and to make our show very different and an escape in some ways from the tragedies of the world. But we ended up having to make that adjustment. I'm glad we did. I think it was the right choice to make.
The directive often came from Rick. I felt I mean, it was during our show that Brannon finally got to write his AIDS allegory, which was, now 25 years after the event. And so I guess in some respects, the fact that we did address 9/11 so in such a focused way in season 3 was a real step forward for Mr. Berman, and a show that he might have said it ain't broke, so why am I trying to fix it?
Well, the ratings were not going in a direction that I think anybody was happy with, for one. And so upping the stakes, upping the drama, was a valid and understandable response. But creatively, it was challenging and it was fun, to be able to find allegories for what was going on in the world and fictionalize it and sci-fi it up a bit and make it Star Trek and make it our show and put our characters through the ringer. There was something really wonderful just in terms of like creatively to be able to take these characters who had been kind of, to a certain extent, a little gung-ho and golly going off into space and then putting them through the ringer and then sending them back to Earth at the end of season 4 where they're just like shell shocked. I mean, certainly Trip was dealing with some, serious trauma. So was Archer, to Paul to a degree. Dominic, I think you got into a bar fight in season 4 in an episode we did.
Yeah, I think I did. That's right. You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And explore, racism on Earth in the Star Trek era. That was like, whoa, yeah, this is how it would happen. This is what it would be like.
Yeah.
So it was, it was quite a journey. It was quite a journey.
I had walking pneumonia the day we shot that bar fight.
Oh, really?
Oh God, I was so sick. Yeah, that was
what keeps a writer in the room? Like you said, our first season, there are some writers of episodes that both Dominic and I are like, I don't remember them.
Who was that? Yeah.
You don't remember the writers, or you don't remember?
Well, there was a Steve. The next episode we're going to come to, which I think Coldfront. This is where they decided to spend some money. There's a lot of CGI in this, and this is when the temporal Cold War makes its introduction. Written by Steve Beck and Tim Finch. I have no recollection of these gentlemen at all. Did they only stay on for season 1?
Yeah, I believe they were only there for season 1.
Had we inherited them from Voyager, or no?
No, Phyllis. I think Rick and Brannon wanted to clean house. I mean, there were a lot of talented writers on Voyager who did not move on to Enterprise. They wanted to do something new, and they were looking for writers who were first and foremost character people, knew how to write great characters, figuring that the Star Trek of it, the sci-fi of it, we would take care of. So there were a bunch of incredibly talented writers, some of whom I'm still friends with, who were brought on season 1, who were sort of virgins to Star Trek. And that ended up being, I think, a bigger liability than we had anticipated, because they would often pitch either episode ideas or character ideas that had been done many, many, many times on the earlier shows, or were more appropriate to the earlier shows, which were set in a different, future historical era. And and it was hard. It was hard watching some of those writers struggling. Like, what do they want from me? You could almost, they were literally asking that question. And often with, a writing credit on a television show, the showrunner ultimately is responsible for that script. And so you may see an episode with a bunch of names on it. Some of those names may have contributed relatively little to the finished episode that you're watching. It's really hard to say. It's hard to also distinguish yourself when you're not the showrunner for that reason, because often the assumption, I think, in the executive suites is the showrunner wrote that episode, or they made it a good episode. They were there shepherding it. That newish writer didn't have the chops to do this. Sometimes that's true, and sometimes it isn't. But yeah, there was a real cleaning of a house at the end of season one. There was uh, not a lot of love for some of the. I mean, it was sort of mutual. I think a lot of those writers had a really frustrating time on season one, and it was difficult even for the veterans, like I think me and Phyllis and Andre, who had been there, because these writers, all of us were asking, what is this show? Who are these people? How is this different from the other shows? What is our how does the series feel compared to the others? And it's also a prequel. We're throwing that into the mix. Some of the early scripts, to Paul sounded very much like 709. And I remember Phyllis during one of the notes meetings pointing out to Brannon how much to Paul sounded in the early scripts like 7 of 9, and he was like kind of taken aback, and I was like kicking her under the table, like, why are you criticizing our boss? But she was absolutely right, and they adjusted the script and made her more Vulcan, more to Paul. They needed to find her voice, and that's a challenge also of doing one of these series right after the other. You don't necessarily have time to really dig in and find out, how is Trip different from, Bones or Scotty or Geordie or
Gordy, right.
or anybody else. You find that over the course of the show, but we were lucky in that we had at the beginning anyway a very supportive network and studio that weren't going to throw the baby out with the bathwater after a couple of episodes. But again, it's still really interesting to me that all of the shows just really seem to have they really take like a year or two to find their footing, with the exception of the original series, which kind of like came out of the gate just amazingly well done. The subsequent shows are all living in the shadows of everything that came before, and they're all kind of tentative. Like, how do we step out of that and do something different, but not too different?
Right.
That's the challenge, I feel.
I remember Brandon saying at one point, he might have been joking, I don't know, maybe he was serious, that he thought he was making Seinfeld in space, which, is ultimately episodes not really about anything.
Right.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I think you could. It's very easy to say, oh, I want this movie, this episode I'm writing, this television series to be about something important, and then you infuse it with what you think of as, and it just comes off as full of itself and trying too hard and
Preachy. Yeah.
And preachy, exactly. It's exactly the word. Yeah. So, I think there's something to be said for taking a step back from that and letting, the theme of the episode find itself. This episode, Civilization, I would say kind of is a Star Trek's version of a Seinfeld, I guess. It's not really about anything. There was a line that I often repeated in the writer's room to my great shame, where someone would ask, you're writers, you're just struggling with an idea, you're trying, is this an episode? I don't know. And somebody would get on their high horse and say, what is this episode about? And I would, say, well, it's about 42 minutes. And then just, move on to the next question. But
and we've got 10.
Yeah, it's a very valid question. What are we
knuckle down?
Even if we're not saying anything important or super original, what is it that emotionally is affecting the people in the story?
Yeah.
Even if it's a guest character, even if it's a guest character, you can do that every now and then. It doesn't necessarily have to be always about our people. But it is about those relationships, the relationship that Trip and Reed had was one of the most fun for me to write.
Thank you. We really we gravitated to that enormously, and
Yeah, I mean, it's not a surprise that, all this time later, you guys are hanging out and have a great, real life banter because you had it on the show. You really
Yeah,
did. And I think
right.
the longer a show goes on, the more the characters become like the cast. And that's a blessing. I mean, you want that to happen.
and the actor becomes more comfortable just with that other actor, or the other actors are more comfortable on set, and more prepared to, as it were, they use the adage, throw it away, uh,
Yeah.
rather than everything you say has the highest importance. And that's, yeah, it's the old, you do the 10,000 hours to learn something to become an expert, and then put it all down and
Yeah.
let the water flow, and that's when it works best. Yeah.
I don't think we were Seinfeld. I think we were The Office, I
Yeah,
mean,
right.
Oh,
these shows,
yeah.
they really are shows about a
Right.
space-going office and the people who work there,
Right.
you know?
Yeah. Yeah. I like that. It's great. It's great to get this sort of insight. I mean, we've Dom, have we had well, we had Brandon, we had Rick, but
Not a writer per se. We had David Livingston on to talk us through the direction of Shuttlepod One. But no, we've had, behind the scenes people like Herman and Doug Drexler, and, we did have Brian Fuller. Yeah.
yeah.
Uh, and but Mike, if you want to come back and talk about future episodes that you penned, we'd love to have you if you've got the time.
Yeah, sounds like a lot of fun. I'd
Are
love
you
to.
busy as hell doing some other stuff at the moment? What's going on in your life?
Working on a couple projects at the moment, nothing that I can chat about,
Mm,
but perhaps next time I'm on in a couple months, I'll be able to. But
Great.
always writing, even if you're not being paid for it. That's the business.
It's a nice thing to be able to do, isn't it? I envy musicians who can pick up the instrument, and you guys that can sit at a desk, and I just wander out to Hollywood Boulevard and start spouting Shakespeare.
Well, you've got the outfit for it because of this episode, right?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Well, thank you, pal. It was
My
really
pleasure.
nice.
Yeah,
There was
really.
one other good joke that I loved was the alien abduction. Apparently, there was a time in your era when that was a thing. And I'd laughed uproariously at that
That
one.
was very clever. It's funny. I remember like the good lines and the good moments, but that was a Brandon line. That was a
Was
Brandon
it? That doesn't
insert
surprise
into
me.
the script, and I wish we'd done more of that in this particular episode. I think it
Yeah.
would have be a little more self-aware of what
Right.
was going on. I think the audience would have been fine with that, but we were still figuring out what we were doing.
We weren't even halfway through the first season. And I get a sense that the next episode, they really went all out to try and, cement an audience, make the show look as, bejeweled as possible, bedazzled. There's so much CGI in there with the temporal, stuff. And Daniels arrives, and yeah, they spent a lot of money. That's for sure.
Yeah, not as much as they spend today, but they
No,
spent a lot back in the
God,
day.
the show. I mean, that Strange New Worlds is it's extraordinary. The production value. It's quite amazing. Yeah,
Yeah, beautiful looking shows.
it is really. Well, it's been lovely seeing you again, man. You look great. You've barely aged a day, really. We're all a bit older.
A little more grizzled.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
lovely to see you, pal.
Yeah,
You got
great
any
to see
plans
you
for the
guys.
weekend? What's going on?
I think this is
Anything else for the weekend, sir?
I think this is it, quite frankly.
This is it. This is the high point.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I do have some rewriting to do, but aside from that, yeah, no, it's a thrill to see you guys and chat with you.
Oh,
Likewise.
thank you. Well,
Awesome.
love to you, man.
Yeah. Thank you.
Great to see you
Lovely
guys.
seeing you. All the best to you.
Okay, take care.